Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's workshop about double counting. This meeting was originally scheduled to conclude at 4 o'clock. It has been extended a half an hour to allow for a longer conversation during our two scheduled panels. We'll apologize to those who may not be able to stick around for the full workshop. A recording of the workshop will be posted on our rulemaking webpage under past workshop materials in the next day. There you may revisit what we discussed today and catch up on anything that you miss. We will begin today's webinar with opening remarks from Glenn Blackman, Manager of the Energy Policy Office at the Department of Commerce, and the Commissioners at the Utilities and Transportation Commission. We are excited to have the California Air Resources Board join us today. CARB will give a presentation on how California treats imported electricity under its cap and trade program. A 20-minute question and answer period will follow their presentation. We respectfully ask that you hold your questions until that time. The second half of our agenda will feature two panel or group discussions. These panels will be moderated by Glenn. We aim for these panel discussions to be free-flowing and interactive between the panelists and moderator. Public comments in the chat may distract panelists or the moderator. We respectfully ask that the public hold their questions or comments to the public comment section, which follows the last panel discussion. The commissioners and UTC staff will have an opportunity at the end of each panel to ask questions. We encourage the public to participate in our discussion today and focus on the merits of the policy options at hand. Please feel free to use the chat function located in the lower part of your browser, and use the raise your hand function to signal that you have a question or comment either during the Q&A period or following CARB's presentation. Please do not use the chat function during any other time, as it may distract presenters or panelists from their presentations. And I got a little jumbled there, so let me clarify myself. We will have the Q&A session after the CARB's presentation, and then there is a public comment section at the end, and it is at that time that we hope to get public comment. As always, please remember to be respectful to presenters and panelists, as well as other members of the public. And with that, I will turn it over to Commissioner Rendell to formally kick off our workshop.
Thank you, Austin. I appreciate it. Welcome everyone to this joint workshop and discussion between the Washington State Department of Commerce and the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission concerning double counting of renewable energy credits. This is also occurring under docket UE 210183. Docket opened at the commission to address the rulemaking in which double counting is being addressed. So I appreciate everyone attending. I look forward to CARB's presentation and the discussion that follows. And again, welcome everyone to the workshop and discussion.
Thanks, Anne. Glenn, would you like to provide introductory remarks and introduce CARB?
Sure, I can do that. I believe I heard Commissioner Blaspas say that he didn't have any opening remarks. Otherwise, I'd want him to do that, and that Chairman Danner will be here soon. My name is Glenn Blackman, and I'm manager of the Energy Policy Office at the Department of Commerce. This is one of many joint workshops that we're doing with the Utilities and Transportation Commission. And it's a format that we found to be really useful since we have so much shared responsibility in implementing the Clean Energy Transformation Act. So I'm glad that we can do that again today. Today, we're going to be focusing on a very narrow provision within CETA that has to do with double counting of renewable energy credits and the environmental attributes that are embedded in those credits. And my hope is that by keeping things really narrow, we can get a better understanding of what's kind of a deceptively complicated question. And to get us started on that, we invited the California Air Resources Board to give us some background information about how the greenhouse gas emissions are accounted for under their program. This is a presentation that they did to the markets work group last summer during that group's investigation of a variety of different issues having to do with CETA's relationship with electricity and carbon markets. And we asked them to come back and present that material again for our benefit and give us kind of a baseline to work from in the discussions that follow. I will note on the agenda that under item 5, which is the first panel discussion, we've got Lisa Gafkin listed for public counsel, but it's actually going to be Dr. Ezra Hausman, who's a consultant for public counsel, who'll be speaking on that panel. Anyway, with that, I will turn it over to Abaj Singh from California Air Resources Board and let him run the presentation and all that. So welcome, Abaj. Thank you again for coming. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Thank you for having me. As Glenn mentioned, my name is Abaj Singh. I am from the California Air Resources Board. I am the EPE specialist, or the Electric Power Entity Specialist for the Mandatory Reporting Regulation Program. I'm actually joined this afternoon by my manager, Ryan Shawland, who's on the call with me and will be taking questions as well as some of my other colleagues in management who will choose to remain silent for now. With that, I think I will go right into the presentation. We have about 30 minutes slated and about 20 slides to go through, so it's a fair bit. Let me see. Can everybody see that? Can somebody just give me a heads up if you can see my slides?
Yep, you're good.
Thank you. I'm like coordinating between 3 different screens and all kinds of stuff here. Right, so this morning we're just going to give you an overview of our cap and trade program and the mandatory reporting regulation. As with all of our presentations, we kind of like to start with our sort of goals and ambitions. So while the topic of this presentation today is electricity sector, we kind of want to give an overview of California's climate goals and our cap and trade program. So most of you are probably acquainted with this graph. You probably have seen it everywhere, but it's always helpful to begin with this slide to remind us of the progress so far and the challenges ahead. So just some brief background. In 2006, AB 32 set our initial 2020 target of returning to 1990 emissions levels. We actually achieved that in 2016. But then again in 2016, we also had a new legislation, SB 32, which called for a 40% reduction in emissions below 1990 levels. So that's the goal we're trying to get to by 2030. So with that goal in mind, CARB adopted a scoping plan in 2017 that laid out a cost-effective and technologically feasible path for achieving the 2030 target. These targets are milestones on the path to our ultimate goal of decarbonization by mid-century, and CARB is currently in the process of updating its scoping plan for 2021. The executive order that was signed by Governor Schwarzenegger established a goal of achieving 80% of greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2050, which is kind of shown here by the yellow line. But if we were to carry and continue our sort of expected or hopeful trajectory of emissions reductions, we would actually arrive at the 2050 target 10 years earlier in 2040. So that's just some brief background. There's one more detail, which is we also have a new goal that was established in 2018 to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. So this calls for even deeper decarbonization than the previous goal, where you would reach that about 5 years sooner. So while our focus today is on the cap and trade program, we always try and show this slide to everybody. That's important to note that California has chosen a portfolio approach to addressing climate change. Cap and trade tends to be the focus, but there's a whole bunch of other programs, and we don't rely on just one program. Instead, there's a series of policies, some of which may overlap to reduce emissions in the state, and the key policies are presented on this slide. So let's delve right into the cap and trade program. So the overall design of the cap and trade is basically, you've got declining emissions caps, you have a steadily increasing price signal, you have a market that targets the lowest cost reductions first, and a long-term price signal to deal with investment certainty. The program establishes a hard declining cap on major sources of statewide greenhouse gas emissions, and it creates a strong long-term economic incentive for investments in cleaner, more efficient technologies. So each entity covered by the program has a compliance obligation that is set by its greenhouse gas emissions, and entities are required to meet that compliance obligation by acquiring and surrendering allowances at a limited quantity of offset credits in an amount that's equal to their compliance obligation. I think most of you might be familiar with how our system works at this point. CARB creates allowances that are equal to the total amount of permissible emissions, which is the cap, over a given compliance period. And then one allowance is equal to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And we use 100-year global warming potentials. Because the cap declines, fewer allocation allowances are created each year, and the overall emissions decrease over time. So the auction mechanism also helps to establish a steadily increasing price signal to invest in cleaner technologies and facilitates addressing the lower cost reductions first. The cap and trade program is one part of our overall climate change strategy, as I mentioned before, to reach our emissions reductions goals. It helps ensure we reach those goals at a much lower cost than an approach that does not include cap and trade. And the program does work in concert with our other air quality and climate policies. So here are some cap and trade facts and figures. As Glenn mentioned, we did give this presentation about a year ago, and since then we have updated it. So for those of you who attended that presentation, these numbers have changed. So some facts and figures about our program is the cap and trade program is economy-wide and covers about 80% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. The program targets large emitters with greater than 25,000 metric tons of CO2e emissions, and it includes electricity importers, natural gas suppliers, and transportation fuel suppliers. There are very high levels of compliance with the program requirements. We've got 100% of entities who are in compliance for the most recent compliance event, which was November 1st of 2020. Our next one is going to be November 1st, 2021. And then through the auction mechanism, the program has resulted in almost $17 billion that have been directed into investments in California, with more than half of those investments going directly to benefit the most impacted communities. So the cap and trade program is a source-based program. So emissions, so we're transitioning now to talk about electricity within cap and trade. Emissions from in-state power generation would be directly regulated. However, as you'll see in the next slide, and I'll show you the pie chart of how emissions break down, a large part of electricity consumed in California is generated outside the state. Making sure that emissions from power generated outside the state is also captured is important, not only for completely capturing all emissions associated with in-state electricity usage, but also to limit emissions leakage and avoid incentivizing generation to be located outside of California. Interstate commerce rules prevented California from directly regulating electricity generation in other states, and the lack of greenhouse gas accounting programs in other states in the West at the time meant that assessing greenhouse gas impacts from imported electricity was the only possibility that we had. So here's a updated breakdown of how our emissions are split across our state. So this slide shows California's total greenhouse gas inventory, which includes sectors that are not covered under cap and trade. You can get a sense of the relative contribution of the electricity sector as a whole, as well as imports specifically. So we have about 9% from in-state generation, 5% from imports, and then we split those imports into about 2.8% for specified imports, which we'll touch in a second, and unspecified imports is about the remaining 2.4%. Right, so greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation to serve California load have decreased about 30% since the start of the program in 2013 to 2019. So this figure shows the greenhouse gas intensity of California's electricity in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per megawatt hour of electricity generated during this same period. The decrease in greenhouse gas emissions from imported electricity is due to reported and verified changes in the mix of generation reported to California, including more hydro from the Northwest and accelerated closure of coal plants in the Southwest. The total amount of electricity imported also declined as California built and used more in-state renewable electricity. So making progress. We were asked to include this slide for this particular presentation. So this graph shows electricity imports by resource type. We also wanted to use this graph to explain what data regarding electricity imports to California is publicly available and where it can be found. So the data in this graph comes from our annual statewide GHG inventory. The second link at the bottom is where you can find terawatt hours of imports aggregated by the resource that we imported power from. This data does not, however, tell you who imported the electricity and in what amount. Our MRR data, the first link on the slide, does show greenhouse gas emissions per electricity importer who reports to us. However, it does not tell you which resources the electricity reporters imported. So one of the questions we do get is sort of the interaction between the relationship between these two, who imported what and from where, and that's confidential and public. So there's no link between these two sources. So you can either see how much a given entity emitted, or you can see which resource we imported most power from, but you don't have a relationship between those two data sets. So jumping right in, I'm going to be really quick about this. When we're talking about EPEs, we're not concerned with in-state generation. We're looking at imports and exports only. Imports are the only thing that have emissions associated with them. We also have wheels reported to us, which is when it's generated outside, comes through California and leaves, but also there's no emissions associated with it. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're focusing on direct imports into California. We do have other reportable transactions. Of course, we have the renewable portfolio standard adjustment. We have the electricity imbalance market, which we'll talk about later. But all of those are some variation of these types of transactions. So the most important thing on this slide is that we regulate at the state line. So this makes things kind of interesting when you're overseeing something as free flowing as electricity. As I like to joke with my colleagues who deal with more tangible products, our product travels at the speed of light. So it makes things a little bit more tricky. Most evident is when we'll talk about MGRPs later, or multi-jurisdictional retail providers. There are a wide variety of EPEs that report to us. We have, IOUs, POUs, EPEs, and CCAs. We also have a few federal entities that report to us as well. We have WAPA, which is our Central Valley project, among other things. And we also have marketers who usually don't have their own load that they serve, at least not in California, but simply transact power. So a couple of our ACSs or asset controlling suppliers, which we'll discuss later, are also separately marketers. So one entity can have two EPE reporting accounts. That's an administrative matter. Right. So power purchases can either be specified or unspecified. So a specified imports are all sources that are located outside of the state. So a specified source of electricity, or a specified source, means a facility or a unit which is permitted to be claimed as a source of electricity delivered. The reporting entity must either have a full or partial ownership in that unit or facility, or a written power contract to procure electricity generated by that facility or unit. So ACSs can be specified sources, but they still have to meet the other specified source requirements. Right. This slide also deals with specified sources. And so we have a variety of different generation sources that can be considered specified. ACSs, your single facility or unit. We also have multiple dams when they are like a FERC hydroelectric license under FERC, or if the entity outright owns these facilities, which makes them a generation providing entity. Those are all categories for specified sources. When we talk about specified sources, what we mean is that we're going to attribute the power or the imports from them with a given or calculated emissions factor. And we use data, publicly posted data from EIA and EPA to generate the emissions factor. For example, a wind resource would have a 0 metric tons of CO2e per megawatt hour, whereas a coal facility is probably going to have upwards of 1 metric ton of CO2e per megawatt hour. Conversely, we have unspecified sources of electricity. So effectively, unspecified source is a catch-all. If they're not a specified source, they do not meet the specified source requirements, then they're an unspecified source. And unspecified sources have a single emissions factor of 0.428 metric tons of CO2e per megawatt hour. And that's how we deal with import reporting. So just some additional information about how we go about reporting. We look at the purchasing selling entity at that last segment into California. So power can sometimes bounce across state borders, go in all different directions. So we're always concerned with who was the last person who held that power and then brought it into our state. We also have retail providers who may not be the direct importers, but they also have to report to us how much was brought in to serve their load. We also, again, exports are very similar to imports. They use the same documentation, but just in the reverse direction, as well as for wheels. All right, let's talk about ACSs. So ACSs, or asset controlling suppliers, are a special kind of entity that have specifically registered with CARB and have been approved as an ACS, as an actual application process for this. The ACS distinction is basically that a network of electricity generation sources can be, for the purposes of reporting in MRR and cap and trade, treated as one facility because they have met a very specific set of requirements detailed in the reg. As such, ACSs have one ARB ID and one system emissions factor used in calculating the emissions associated with power from that resource. So in essence, an ACS is treated as a specified source. This is also including with regard to like contracts and seller requirements. So they will actually list the ACS name and not the individual resources that compile it. For the time being, we only have two ACSs, which is Bonneville Power Administration and Tacoma Power. We did have a third, but they ceased to be an ACS. They voluntarily chose not to be an ACS. The other entity we also have are multi-jurisdictional retail providers. So a MGRP basically serves customers across our state lines. So in this case, there's only one MGRP that we have, which is Pacific Core, and they have customers that they serve in Oregon as well as California. So their emissions for an MGRP are based on like specified emissions factors that are calculated from their entire system. They are similar to ACSs, but where an ACS can apply and become an ACS, MGRPs they don't have an option. They have to report as an MGRP. And as I mentioned, the only one we have is Pacific Core. And for those maths nerds out there, we have this exceedingly complicated equation. If any of you are interested, how we calculate their system emissions factor. One of the other entities we deal with is, of course, CAISO's Energy Imbalance Market, which is ever growing. So the EIM is a real-time energy market that identifies the lowest cost power to serve demand. The participants include a GHG bid adder for resources that may be deemed into California. And then these deemed imports into California are provided, this information is provided to EPEs by CMRI. And that's what they use to report to us. So they don't use e-tags like you use for other transactions, but they do have the same reporting and verification requirements as EPE. So the documentation might be slightly different, but everything else is effectively the same. Just like for other specified imports, the emissions is calculated based on the emission profile of the generation source that imported power into California. This is our last slide. Then you come down and it's a good overview as well. So as I mentioned before, for the cap and trade program, all the programs are complementary, but each has its own separate requirements. The cap and trade program compliance is based on allowances that are retired. So one allowance, as I mentioned, is equal to 1 metric tons of CO2e, pretty straightforward. We also have an RPS compliance, which is based on the renewable energy credits that are generated and retired. Oh, same thing, one REC is 1 megawatt hour of renewable electricity. You have options for RECs to be bundled or unbundled, but they always include the environmental attributes. And then for cap and trade reporting, reporting specified sources from eligible renewable resources requires reporting of REC serial numbers. So we focus on the imports first, establishing that. And then if they are eligible renewable resources, we require that they also report the associated RECs. The reporting of so for the last bullet, which is the reporting of zero emission renewables, do not constitute a claim on the environmental attributes and does not require the retirement of RECs. So in a capped program, no emissions are avoided by the generation of the renewable electricity. Let me just read this comment to you. So in cap and trade, reporting renewable electricity does not constitute a claim of environmental attributes. As I mentioned earlier, cap and trade is a source-based program, and our goal is to account as best we can for the emissions profile of the source. Looking at it another way, our program doesn't account for RECs in state renewable generation. We don't regulate those sources that don't report under cap and trade at all, since they're generally below the reporting threshold. Similarly, what that final sub-bullet is getting at is that the renewable electricity that is in the cap and trade program, we're trying to reduce emissions from capped sources that report to us. We're agnostic about where those reductions come from. So even though the renewable electricity might enable those emissions reductions, the REC itself doesn't represent those avoided emissions. And with that, I think 3 minutes to spare. Yeah, time for questions. Thank you.
That's great, Abaj. I really appreciate you going through that for us. And I'm going to jump in with the first question, if I may. If you could go back one slide. In terms of the that second to the last bullet point, I'm a little uncertain about why you would be collecting REC serial numbers if you're not using the RECs to, as kind of part of the verification of the imports as being from renewable sources. So what's the purpose of reporting the serial numbers there?
So we have these RECs reported to us so that we have a record of this power, so this renewable power that was imported into California. So if there was ever a question as to, hey, this REC is being used elsewhere for reporting in some other program, for example, anywhere else, we have a record that says this REC was used and linked with the power that was imported into our state. If that makes sense.
And so then that REC would be actually owned by the entity in California that's subject to the RPS. Is that how that would work? Or
this might be a question. Give me 1 second. Sorry. Ooh, what did I do? So we don't care whether they retire or own them after the fact is effectively it. It's kind of the matter with these RECs. It's at the time that we're reporting, they have to have had ownership of it in order to report it. But after the fact, if they want to sell it or move it along, we're not concerned with that. Okay,
so you've identified that connection between the electricity and the REC, but there's not a requirement under cap and trade for the retirement of that REC, I think is what you said.
Yeah, so there's 2 instances where RECs are reported for under MRR reporting, which is data that goes to cap and trade. You have to report RECs if there's any eligible renewable facility. So if it's a specified import that you're reporting, you don't have to retire the RECs. You just need to report it to us. If you are trying to claim an RPS adjustment, which is an additional type of reporting that actually reduces your compliance obligation, then you are required to retire your RECs in order to meet those requirements.
Okay. And just maybe for the benefit of the further discussion, I just want to kind of put some of Abaj's terms in context. And that is that in this workshop, we're focused on specified imports. So if it's being imported to California unspecified, then it's not really of interest today. But where it's a specified import and it's from a generating facility that is zero emissions, so like a wind or renewable would be an example of that. So imports that are unspecified, we know there's an allowance requirement for those at the default rate, and imports that are specified as being from an emitting source, we know there's an allowance requirement for those too. It's the group where it's specified but zero emission. That's not really a question, Abaj. I was just trying to
yes,
but explain the words.
Yes, I just to clarify, so a zero emission resource can actually be unspecified if you don't have a contract for the power. Yeah. So there's no given that something is specified. What makes something specified is that you can prove the power that was imported into California came from that resource, and that you had a contract for that power, or you owned that power when it was brought in. Those are the two requirements. So even if you can prove that power came from a zero emission resource, but if you bought it off the ice, and you didn't have a contract for it, it will be deemed as unspecified.
And then allowances would be required.
Yes, I mean, they will be required as long as the emissions are associated with it. It would be the default emissions factor.
Okay.
Would apply, yes.
So, and I saw some questions in the chat. So maybe Austin, you could do a little emceeing of those. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I'd also like to give the commissioners and UTC staff an opportunity to ask any questions before we go to those comments in the chat.
This is Commissioner Rendall. I think you can go directly to the chat for me.
All right, well, the first question we have in the chat, I believe, is a clarification question from Kevin Holland, which is, would you say that the cap and trade emissions has to do with the exhaust of a facility, whereas a REC has to do with the fuel source?
I'm sure there's a relationship between the two, but I've never seen it that way. We look at, when we're calculating emissions factor, we just look at what was emitted from the facility, and then if they're eligible renewable resource and they have RECs associated, then that's a secondary reporting requirement for them. But I've never looked at it in that particular way. Yeah.
And then we got two questions here from Todd Jones. I don't know if Todd, if you'd like to come up, unmute and ask your questions, invite you to do that as well, rather than have me read them.
Sure, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. My first question was just, my understanding is that the REC serial reporting requirement in the MRR is a requirement, but that it's not necessarily, you don't need to comply with that requirement in order to achieve a qualified positive verification statement. That is, if you don't report the REC serial numbers, you can still receive a qualified positive verification statement. And so my question is, could there then be, emissions associated with renewable energy imports for which the REC serial number was not reported? And then if so, what proportion of reported renewable energy imports, specified renewable energy imports, are assigned, a zero emissions factor and not providing CARB with the REC serial information? And then my second question is, the REC serial number information that you do collect, would CARB be willing to make those REC serial numbers public so that other programs in other states or other voluntary programs can identify those RECs for use in their own programs?
So to answer your second question first, is we have offered to publish serials in the past, but all we can say right now is that that is something we can respond to if there's a request for those REC serial numbers.
Bob, do you want me to respond to Todd's other questions?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay. Hi, this is Ryan Shaw, and I'm the manager of the verification section at CARB. So let me make sure I get both of your questions, Todd. So yeah, if the electricity imports meet all of the requirements that Abaj went over for, being a specified source import, so the ownership or contract requirement, they're required to report as specified import at that emission factor. And then if the associated REC serial numbers for that import are not reported, they still have to report that as a specified source import at that emission factor, regardless of whether they are able to report those REC serial numbers. So we consider that what we call a non-conformance with our regulation, but the emission factors are still accounted for instance, as a zero emission factor with a wind or solar resource or something like that. So in your example, yes, there could be specified source imports that are reported as eligible renewable that don't have associated rec serial numbers reported to us. That would show up as a nonconformance in our verification process. We'd call that a qualified positive verification statement, and they would have some additional requirements for the following year for verifiers to do a little bit of extra work to make sure they can still meet all of the standards, but those emissions would still apply as coming from that eligible renewable resource. And so as for what proportion of the renewable electricity imports are counted without reporting the rec serial numbers, we can't tell you exactly. That's confidential information that's submitted to us. We can say that our in general, our compliance rates are really high in our program. So you can see in our public emissions data that Abaj linked to earlier, the verification statement that are ultimately submitted for each electric power entity. You can see in almost all of those cases, there are positive verification statements. If you see qualified positive next to it, that means there was some kind of nonconformance associated with it. But with that public data, we can't tell you like where that nonconformance came from. It just says that there was a nonconformance that existed. Does that answer your question, Todd?
Yes, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thanks everyone. Our next question comes from Lisa Rennie at Tacoma Power. She asks, when will CARB revisit its default emissions factor for unspecified power, given California's progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
I can take a stab at that. Abaj or Rachel, feel free to jump in. Rachel's another one of our colleagues who works directly in the cap and trade program. The emission factor for unspecified source imports is 0.428 metric tons of CO2e per megawatt hour. And so to Lisa's question, as the grid gets a little bit cleaner, have we talked about updating that number? So we haven't made any commitments to or plans to update that. It's been the same since the beginning of the program. When we've revisited it periodically, what that number is really trying to approximate is not a grid average so much as the types of generation resources that are on the margin. And so that number, if you're familiar with emission factors from a variety of different resources, that one kind of approximates like a simple cycle natural gas peaking turbine, which, even with a cleaner grid and higher renewables penetration, is still a lot of what we see kind of filling in the gaps when renewables aren't available. So that's what that's tried to sort of approximate. So, to answer Lisa's question, we don't have a timeline for updating that again, but that's sort of our logic and thought process for that particular emission factor.
And Ryan, this is Rachel Golden, the cap and trade program. The only thing I would add to that is that we did revisit and review in our analysis in our 2018 rulemaking about whether or not we should update the default emission factor. And at that time, that analysis indicated that marginal emission factor was still in the range that it had been when we established the program. And just to like double down on Ryan's point, this is really looking at what the marginal emission factor is in the whole WEC, not California specifically, because we're looking at imports into California. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the rest of you.
I think I'll take the next question since it was emphatically directed at me. So if a REC doesn't meet California's definition of a REC, for instance, a REC that was generated by large hydro, does CARB recognize that REC? And then, for instance, if large hydro in the Northwest imported into California and for the purposes of Washington, it created a REC, then is CARB concerned with that REC? So there's a definition in our regulation for what is considered eligible renewable for REC reporting requirements. And that is through the CEC. So that is where we get the list. So if the entity in question does not appear on that list, it's not qualified as eligible renewable, and we do not require REC reporting for that.
And Abaj, the CEC is the California Energy Commission, who runs our renewable portfolio standard. Just in case that something gets lost in acronyms, which sometimes it does.
It does. 4 years ago when I joined, I used to spell it all out because even I needed it in my head, and now it's just, kind of just rolled out. Sorry. is that all we have for questions?
That's all I'm seeing currently in the chat. Encourage folks to either put their questions in the chat or ask a question. Steve, you have a question?
Sorry for the slow unmute here, folks. Yeah, this is Steve Johnson, and I just trying to think through so that we aren't counting resources twice between the two regions and the two programs, Washington State's and California's. I'm thinking through my head an example where an owner of, let's just for simplicity, a gas plant and a wind plant, they schedule a gas plant in for the first hour and say, this is the gas plant. And so you assess a emissions factor that's probably pre-calculated. The next hour they submit instead the wind facility. And of course, then you wouldn't assess an allowance for that base because you've determined that has no emissions. But then I'm concerned about how we all keep straight who's claiming that resource output. You know, we were thinking about tracking RECs, but then that's confusing because our idea behind it, the resource is that no one else is making any claims to its attributes. But it seems pretty clear you are, which is fine. That's what the seller wants to do. But can we brainstorm on any way to make these programs fit together? Is there, I mean, I'm willing to, we have a docket for rulemaking open. So we're really more than pleased to try to accommodate a fit together. But I'm not sure who's going to control that REC or how we're going to count the generation output between the two systems. Do you guys have any ideas on how we all go about doing that?
So as far as the hourly scheduling question, you know, we do have some kind of we do anticipate that the issue where generation resources are scheduled into the system and the emissions-free generator isn't generating sufficient electricity to make whole that ETAG. And so what that looks like on our system, and Steve, apologies if this is not directly responsive to your question, but your question did make me think about it. So if a scheduler's planning to import 100 megawatts over the course of an hour of wind generation, we require that the importer look at the actual generated power on that hourly basis to make sure that enough power was generated from that facility to make that tag whole. And if they didn't, if they look at that the generation on the hourly basis compared to an ETAG, and they only produced 80 megawatts where they said they were going to be importing 100, they have to account for that incremental 20 megawatt hours as at the unspecified rate. So I don't know if that doesn't really answer all of your questions, but I think it maybe speaks to your original concern or your first kind of example.
Well, there are quite a few concerns, so don't feel, just start answering them all. That would be wonderful. Yes, just to clarify for folks, there's an electronic tag for generation injection, and it usually has a point of withdrawal. That's the point at which it's delivered to by the transmission service provider. But also to be clear, those ETAGs are updated after the hour ETAGs or hourly documents. And so what Ryan, I think you're talking about is the updated ETAG, which would show the actual output of that hypothetical wind resource that I was speaking of. And yeah, there's that element of like, well, what are you counting in terms of generation from that specified resource? But then there's the question of what thing are we going to count to make sure that we're not claiming the same resource that you just claimed. We were thinking about tracking RECs rather than the actual generation output. But if you're just tracking the generation output, then we could shift that way, I guess. But somehow we need to match. We can't count two different things that don't fit together. So I'm hearing that you do count the generation output from those external resources deemed to be imported to California. You do collect the serial numbers for RECs, but I haven't quite heard that we could get that data, match it together, and use it to prevent double counting when we receive that same information about generators for compliance in Washington State. Do you think there's a way we could put those data systems together to kind of make sure there's nothing slipping through the cracks?
As Abaj mentioned in response to Todd's question, we have in the past discussed whether we could publish the REC serial number data that comes into us and just make that available publicly. That's something we would have to explore that I couldn't, commit to you on the call today. But that's something that we could look at. And then, beyond that, I know the conversations between our jurisdictions are ongoing, and that there's a lot of interest in California and making sure that, we are responsive to any kind of questions and making sure that our two systems can fit together as well as possible, because obviously we've been great partners for a long time in terms of the electricity market and also share a common goal of reducing GHG emissions. So, if we can't hash it out today, obviously, but I know those conversations are ongoing, and I know we're more than happy to continue those discussions elsewhere as well.
Well, thanks, Ryan. I mean, just to say that the Commission's authority over IOUs is probably broad and frankly scary to them. So, we could compulse a lot of data collection, but what we want to do is and it could be a bunch of different kinds of data. What I want to do is think of what would match the data that you're collecting and find a place where we could match it together. I don't even necessarily want to see it in this, other than to assure that there's somebody doing a good job matching it so that nothing falls through the cracks. So we'll keep a dialogue open about what kind of data to collect, whether it be the generation output or the RECs or both. It's interesting to hear that I'll just note this to the crowd. It's interesting to hear that you're collecting hourly data by E-tag. Those are the updated E-tags after the hours completed to show the actual generation output of the unit. I assume you do that for gas plants also, or other resources than wind. Isn't that true?
Yeah, that's correct. Although I would just mention that, as a matter of course, CARB itself doesn't generally collect that data. They are required to maintain it, and they have to share it with their third-party verifiers to make sure that's all trued up. But yeah, it's generally the same thing with natural gas or even coal plants. Of course, the scrutiny with which the verifier looks at it might be a little bit different, because the risk of, from an emissions perspective of underreport, excuse me, how would I say that? That lesser of analysis that we discussed to make sure that the generation from the resource makes the tag whole, that is going to be a little bit of a different context with an emitting plant, natural gas or a coal plant. So the requirement there is specifically on zero emission plants, but I think we'd expect them to have that same kind of data for natural gas or coal plants as well.
Hey, Ryan, that's really helpful. Thank you for the presentation and responding to this dialogue, because I kind of wanted to see how we could fit things together. But I'm going to give the floor back to Austin to see if there are other questions in the chat and other folks who might want to speak up on this subject.
Yeah, Abaj, do you want to address Ezra's question about Northwest Hydro qualifying as emissions free, but aren't required for REC verification?
Yeah, I can do that pretty quickly. So I like to think of it as a two-step process. You have, is this from hydro or a zero emission resource? Yes, you have, then you get your zero emissions. Is it an eligible renewable facility? Yes, then you need to report RECs. They're not related to each other. So the correct answer to your question would be, I wouldn't say Northwest Hydro in general, but if it's not an eligible renewable resource, then no, you're not required to report RECs. But if it's still a zero emission resource, you will still get that zero emissions factor, so long as you have your contracts in place to prove that a specified source.
Perfect, thanks. And then we have one more question and then we're going to go to a break. Nicholas Garcia Vapuda asked about Governor Newsom's emergency executive order to address grid capacity deficits and whether that would affect the cap and trade program. Kind of keeping with our opening remarks, kind of looking at imports of electricity, is there anything that we've really touched on today that would change because of that order? I believe is what Nicholas is getting at.
So the answer is no, and jokingly, as long as the lights stay on. Yes.
Very good. All right, well, let us all take a break. Thank you so much, Vaj and Ryan, Rachel, for coming and speaking. Glenn, do you have any words to say before we go to break?
I just one point real quick, and that's about magnitude. The slide that you showed about the overall imports, I wanted to compare that to the total electricity consumption in the state of Washington, which is about 93 terawatt hours. So California's imports are, give or take 20%, about equal to Washington's total consumption. And then I think within the California imports, the ones that we're focused on most directly, the zero emission specified ones are about 7% of the total California ones in the last year in the data series. Anyway, I just wanted to note that for context purposes as we move ahead with our discussion. Thank you again for coming back for a repeat performance. I think I at least understand it a little better the second time through than I did the first time. And for many people, this was the first time. So we really appreciate you doing this.
Thanks for inviting us back. It's our pleasure. Anytime.
All right, everyone, we'll see you in 10 minutes at 10:02, or 1:02, or 2:02.
2:02.
We'll get there. All right, I know. All right. Well, my grandmother's choo-choo clock has finished its announcement that it's 2 o'clock. And we will be getting started here in a minute or so with our panel discussions. So I'm going to set those up for us. Glenn, would you like to make any introductory remarks for this section while I get our participants all pinned into the gallery, if you will say?
It sounds a little bit painful, but I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's okay once you're done with it. I'll explain a little bit about format here and a little background. We have found with some other workshops that it's helpful to kind of focus the discussion by bringing in commenters, who made written comments on a particular topic and letting them discuss with each other and us those comments. And so we broke it into a couple of groups today. And the first panel, we've got a couple of people who in their written comments took the position that this interaction between the California cap and trade system and our use of unbundled recs didn't result in any double counting at all. So we wanted to explore that with them a little bit and see if we could get a better understanding of it and the circumstances where that would apply. And then the second panel will be a group of commenters who felt like there was some double counting that occurred between these two programs. And then we'll talk with them some about their understanding of why that's the case and how they might propose to address it. I'm going to hope to get to some questions about what you would do about it, even with the first panel as well. So we do have Claire Bradenich from the Western Power Trading Forum and Ezra Hausman, who's here on behalf of Public Counsel. Public Counsel represents residential and small business ratepayers in Washington before the Utilities and Transportation Commission. Dr. Hausman has served as an expert for them on some of the issues that we've been addressing during CETA implementation. I can see Ezra on my screen. I don't see Claire yet.
I'm here, Glenn.
You're here. Okay, good.
And I'm looking a little scruffy since my cross-country road trip, so I'm not turning my camera on.
All right. Well, that's everybody's choice. Ezra, do you have any opening comments you want to make just to kind of get us warmed up?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I always look scruffy, so I apologize for that. My primary comment is that as Abij was explaining, the non-power attribute associated with RECs is the fact that it comes from a qualifying renewable resource in whatever RPS program is being applied to. And that's it. I mean, that's how RPS rules work. There is no way, even though RPS rules are absolutely a crucial part of many states meeting their emissions goals, there is no way to actually determine what the emissions benefit of a REC is. And as the folks from CARB have pointed out, in a cap and trade program, there is no marginal emissions benefit of generating a REC because emissions are capped in that program. So they're really just very different things. One counts emissions from resources, so it doesn't count anything having to do with renewable resources. And the other counts RECs, and all it counts is megawatt hours. You know, they're they aren't the same thing. And that's why the position that that public counsel has taken and that I support is that it really isn't double counting because the renewable attribute is accounted for by the REC. I just would like to add that it also is infeasible in my mind to try to count the two together. And the reason is, if you were to deliver a renewable low carbon energy to California and not qualify that REC under subpart B, when we're only talking about the alternative compliance subpart B of CETA, then you would just invite REC shuffling. That REC would be sold to some other entity in the West or somewhere else, and then that that entity could sell a REC into Washington. So that would result in extra cost for Washington ratepayers, but no extra environmental benefit. So I just feel like it's and again, just talking about subpart B and subpart A, no question, you have to deliver the power, and then you have to retire any renewable attribute. I apologize for my dog whining in the background. Perhaps he's telling me that I've made enough of an opening statement. So
it could be. How about you, Claire? Would you like to open up with a few remarks too?
Sure. Thanks, Glenn. And I just want to note that I have my dog sitting here too, and she is much better behaved. So just a couple of things in terms of where WPTF sees this question come from. And to a certain extent, I think I'm very much aligned with the points that Ezra made. I would certainly agree that RECs were not conceived and not designed to account for actual emissions. That's been true from the get-go. I think Washington is trying to force them to account for emissions, but they're not well suited to do so for several of the reasons that Ezra noted. That said, I think there's two types of emission attributes that continually get conflated when you start talking about RECs and when you start talking about delivery of electricity to load or to specific states. That's the actual emission rate of the resource. And then there's the avoided emission rate that is represents displaced, in my view, it represents displaced thermal generation from generation by a renewable or zero emission resource. RECs, if you look across the definitions of RECs throughout most of the programs in the United States that I'm aware of, they typically focus on the avoided emission attribute because the person who claims that REC is making a claim to having done something good through its activities and both claim an actual type of generation as well as potentially doing good things. On the other hand, the actual emission rate of the resource, I think, appropriately gets assigned with the power, either at the generator level of a resource within a cap and trade program, or the electricity that's delivered to a state or imported to a state under the cap and trade program. I think the fact that the emission rate goes with the generation or goes with the electricity itself is evidence from the fact that we are having this very contentious use debate about the 80%. If we didn't believe that the emission rate flows with the electricity, we wouldn't be having a discussion about use because that's exactly what we're debating there. Conversely, the unbundled RECs and the 20% are a different animal. They're sold and bought separately from the power. They are typically sold separately from a PPA, so there's no actual transaction of power. You just go to a market and pick up RECs. And then I guess the final point I would make with respect to how they're used within the CETA, the unbundled RECs are clearly being used. It's clearly the avoided emission attribute of the unbundled RECs that's being used under the 20% in the CETA, because you are effectively pairing those RECs with emitting or unspecified market purchases and then calling that a greenhouse gas neutral standard. That doesn't work if you're assigning a zero emission rate. If you're claiming the zero actual emission rate of a resource and then pairing it with an unspecified emission rate or a gas emission rate, you're left with the gas emission rate. It only works, it only gets you to zero if you're applying the negative emission attribute, which is the avoided emission attribute of that unbundled rec. I think I'll stop here.
Okay. So I think that one point that maybe has become pretty clear in this discussion, but I just want to sit with it for a second, and that is that because of the overall cap on emissions in California or another jurisdiction that had a cap and trade program, the import of a zero emission resource won't, as long as that cap is binding, won't reduce the overall emissions. It'll allow a shift of emissions that might otherwise have come from electricity to then be used in some other sector of the California economy. It could be in manufacturing or transportation or something like that. So that because of the cap operating and people emitting up to the cap, that substituting a emissions-free import in place of fossil generation of electricity doesn't reduce overall emissions in California. Is that the way each of you are approaching this question?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with that. It does not take away from the fact that California has the cap and trade program absolutely reduces emissions.
Yeah.
The fact that it has a renewable, an RPS, and has historically had an RPS program makes it much less costly to reach that cap. But it is true that a cap is a cap. So if you import low carbon energy or zero carbon energy, you don't need a permit for that. It frees up the permit for some other form of emissions. And that's exactly how a cap and trade program is intended to work.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I think it's the wrong question, quite honestly. CETA is an electricity program. It's a clean electricity program. It's not an all emissions economy-wide program. I think it's completely appropriate for Washington regulators to think about whether program design leads to unintended consequences, but I would argue that those unintended consequences should be relegated to the electricity sector. And I would argue that the appropriate question to ask here is, what does it do to emissions across the WEC? While it is absolutely true that California's accounting of imported electricity affects emissions accounted under the program, it is not true that California's accounting necessarily impacts emissions across the WEC. Because as I indicated earlier, for any given amount of load within the WEC, generation by a renewable resource will displace thermal somewhere in the system. That happens regardless of whether that renewable resource is located in California, whether it's located outside of California and imports to California, whether it's located in Washington State, or whether it's located somewhere else and imports to Washington State. The impact on West-wide emissions will be the same. In California's program, you're absolutely right that attribution of the zero emission rate to a resource, be it an in-state resource or an import, will in fact reduce emissions that are accounted under the program and thus the allowances under the program. But I also, within that program, don't think it's as simple as saying, well, clearly there will be increased emissions under the program, because what drives an entity's decisions about whether to reduce its emissions is the price. And there are far more complex interactions between the electricity sector and other sectors driving whether you see an impact, whether California's accounting of some small portion of electricity imports has a measurable effect on the price of allowances, and whether that impact on price affects behavior in other sectors? I don't think that's a straightforward linear question. I think the question that Washington should really be thinking about is, does implementation of the program going to have unintended consequences on Western emissions? And I don't believe that an interpretation that would say that unbundled, there is no double counting of unbundled RECs if the actual emission rate of that resource is attributed under California's program and the avoided emission rate of that resource is claimed for the alternative compliance under CETA. I think you get the exact amount of WEC-wide emissions that you would without that outcome, or with if you had a different rule.
Under that analysis, then any renewable generation in the West is going to displace thermal somewhere in the West. And so you're saying that that attribute that it's avoiding some emissions somewhere is equally valid without knowing whether or not that renewable electricity was delivered to California.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay. And so, you know, this standard that we're talking about here, the 2030 standard that allows for up to 20% compliance using alternative options such as RECs. The legislature refers to that as the greenhouse gas neutral standard. And so even though, you know, we may think about that, well, RECs are denominated in megawatt hours, not in emissions tons. It does seem like we need to be able to draw a connection between emissions and megawatt hours in order to fulfill that characterization of the standard as being greenhouse gas neutral. And the definition of a REC includes, you know, as one of the attributes that's embodied in the REC is the avoided emissions. So Ezra, I wanted to kind of let you react to that argument that I just made, or that line of reasoning, where I'm suggesting that there is an emissions attribute that's embodied in the REC. It's not simply a representation of megawatt hours. Do you feel like that makes a difference in terms of whether we need to be able to identify a REC as having caused a reduction in emissions somewhere in order for us to avoid double counting?
Well, I think the difficulty of imputing an emissions characteristic to a REC is that there's simply there's no record, there's no accounting for what that emissions benefit actually is. You would have to you'd have to know exactly where the REC came from and when and what the policy regime was, and do detailed modeling in order to determine what resource was displaced, what resource was on the margin, to know actually what the greenhouse gas impact was. I think if we're, really going to look at this honestly, if you just take a megawatt REC under subpart B, we don't really know if you are precisely meeting the greenhouse gas neutral standard, because we, again, just don't know what exactly the benefit is. I think this is why it's alternative compliance and not primary compliance, and why it goes away when you have a 100% clean standard. But if you're just doing it megawatt for megawatt, you don't know if what you're displacing in somewhere else has the same carbon emission as what you are trying to compensate for in Washington generation. So it's a very good question. I'm not sure that the legislature fully did the math in terms of that, but I think it's they were balancing a very strict orthodox interpretation of greenhouse gas neutral with, cost and achievability. And I think, it gets very close, but we just, there's no way to know whether you have a precise neutrality.
Mhm. Claire, did you have anything more you wanted to add on that point, or
Yeah, I guess just a comment on Ezra's point. I'm comfortable with that level of uncertainty in terms of considering it greenhouse gas neutral, because the same argument would apply for market purchases. So for if utilities are using the greenhouse gas neutral standard and unbundled RECs, they're most likely applying them against unspecified market purchases. We don't know exactly what those resources, those market purchases represent either. We're accepting uncertainty and saying, okay, we're going to apply an unspecified emission rate for those market purchases. Similarly, I think we accept the same uncertainty on the REC side and say, yes, the any bias washes out. It may be a peaker, it may be something more efficient, but we'll just apply the unspecified emission rate for both. So I think you can have an argument for saying that's a greenhouse gas neutral result for purposes of the CETA.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think, California went through a long process, especially like with the EIM accounting, but in general, with all of the attribution, there's this whole question of what's deemed delivered to California. I mean, look, this isn't perfect. You can't track exactly what electricity comes from where and what it's displacing all the time. So we do our best. We implement strong policies, as Washington has, that are going to move in that direction, but there is going to be some uncertainty.
So, understanding your view about that there's not a concern in your mind with double counting in the California transactions. Do you have any suggestions nonetheless about how, if we were to identify those as being a situation where double counting exists, any suggestions on either good or bad ways of actually implementing that? Any concerns? I don't know, Dr. Hausman, you'd expressed concern about kind of shuffling. Now, I don't know if in the back of your mind you've got an answer to potential shuffling of RECs, but if either of you have any ideas about, like, well, if you're going to do it, then at least do it this way kind of question.
Well, I wouldn't come in favor of doing it, so it's hard for me to say that do it this way. I guess I would flag a couple things that I would be aware of. One is I wouldn't necessarily assume that anything that's being claimed by a Washington utility is owned or contracted solely by that utility. There are numerous resources out there that sell the output of their facilities to multiple different utilities or more than one utility. And where the disposition of that power goes may differ from time of year, time of day. I don't know the details of those contracts. So I don't think anything you do can be tied to a specific resource or whether, I'm not saying this very clearly, just assuming that just because part of a resource's output goes to California doesn't mean it all goes to California. I guess that would be the biggest concern that I would flag.
Right. So the idea of kind of assuming that if they sell anything to California, that the entire output would be off limits, you'd caution against that.
Yes, I would add, I mean, we have a climate crisis. and it's going to cost money to change over our energy system to be zero carbon. And consumers are going to have, ratepayers are going to have to pay for that. And so I think that we just need to make sure that everything we're doing has benefits that are commensurate with the costs. And I think trying to create rules that don't really jibe with how the energy system actually works is just going to make things more complicated and increase costs. I mean, would it be better if we had a West-wide or a nationwide strong climate policy? Of course, that would be better, make things simpler, and it'd be less cost, but we're not there yet. So what we need to do is do things that are going to have the maximum benefit, but not unduly burden ratepayers. And I think trying to impose rules that can be gotten around with rec shifting or that aren't actually going to have additional emissions benefits. And of course, we all share the same atmosphere. So in Washington, out of Washington, in California, it doesn't matter for carbon emissions. I just think that's sort of the wrong way to go. I mean, I think we have good, strong rules, but we need to implement them in a way that makes sense and is not unduly burdensome for ratepayers.
Great, thank you. And so that was the conversation that I wanted to have with you two. And Austin, I think at this point, we could see if the commissioners or the commission staff want to join this in any way, or follow up. It'd be good. And I'm not sure how much time we have left either, but I think we still have a bit, right?
Yeah, we have 10 minutes for questions.
Great.
So this is Commissioner Rendell, and I would just say I very much appreciate the conversation that you just had. I thought that was very helpful. It highlighted a few things for me. So I just appreciate Claire and Ezra, your comments, and Glenn, your questions. So I don't have anything further to add at this point.
Thank you.
Hi, Glenn. This is Dave Danner. I just, the same thing. I think this has been a very interesting conversation. I'm taking a lot of notes. I don't have any particular questions right now, but I'm going to digest all this, and I look forward to the next panel as well.
Steve, you sent me a comment that you had. Did you want to discuss that?
Yeah, I'm kind of stuck looking at the law and following its language rather than inventing rule or really space to sort of theorize what a better system could be than what the legislature directed through its statutory language. And so I want to direct people to 3 portions of CETA, and I tried to drop them in the box, but they were awfully large. And the first is the definition of a non-power attribute that includes all environmentally related characteristics. Then the second is the definition of a renewable energy credit that includes all the non-power attributes. And then finally, we get down to the alternative compliance section, 0401BII, and it says using unbundled renewable energy credits that provide there is no double counting of any non-power attributes. So it's a little hard for me to understand. I mean, just trying to get it past the court. If a power producer said, "Hey, I said that this was for the cap and trade," in my example I provided to CARB earlier today, this afternoon, this is a wind generator, and hey, it doesn't have any emissions, and then turn around and say, well, I didn't use all, I still have all the environmental attributes per the statutory language. What would you say to a court? I mean, it seems like representing that it doesn't have any emissions is pretty much one of the environmental attributes of the non-power attributes. So looking at these 3 sections of the law, what would you tell them?
So I haven't memorized all of the sections, but I have memorized a lot of them. And
Unfortunately.
subpart, 1B says all of the environmental attributes, and it specifically says associated with the renewable energy credit. So I guess, not being an attorney myself, but having been exposed to a lot of them in my career, I would tend to say, yes, we're looking at the credits that are the attributes associated with renewable energy credits. And there's lots and lots of history and lots of implementation all over the country that says that attribute is what did it come from a qualifying renewable resource. There's nothing in qualifying a REC that has to do with what its emissions profile is. Granted, that's the point. And we're very happy that they're low emissions and it's part of a low emissions energy strategy, but that is not the attribute that is accounted in a REC.
Just for the benefit of the participants, those definitions are at the end of the agenda on this, for this workshop, if you want to refer to them.
And Steve, I'll give you my 2 cents. One, I said earlier in the conversation that I strongly believe that RECs were not conceived and designed for greenhouse gas accounting. I don't know how long the definition of non-power attribute has existed in Washington's law. I know that similar definitions exist in a lot of state laws, and all those definitions predate cap and trade, predate state national efforts to really rigorously account for greenhouse gas emissions on a source by source basis, which is effectively what cap and trade is intended to do. So I would argue that the definition is somewhat archaic and it wasn't really well thought through when CETA was being designed as to whether that's appropriate for what we're doing. And certainly was it appropriate given that we're looking forward as well to implementing a cap and trade program within Washington state as well. The second thing I would note is that California has a very similar definition of RECs and environmental attributes on the books in its state as well. And the California Air Resources Board is on record, as well as the other agencies, as saying we have taken the view of these 3 agencies that those non-power attributes do not include the actual emission rate of the resource. So they had a similar situation and they came out with an interpretation that fits with their implementation of the cap and trade program. The third thing I would just note is you get an observed result if you consider that, if you take that definition too literally, because you're saying that the REC includes both the actual emission rate of the resource as well as the zero emission, as well as the avoided emissions. So you've got the REC carrying both a zero emission attribute as well as a negative 4.28 metric ton emission attribute. So you're saying it has both. You're also coming to an observed result if you say that those 2 things can't get separated, because then how do you argue that a renewable resource in Washington gets to actually be zero emission under the cap and trade program, but sell the REC to another entity for compliance with either the CETA or 937? Clearly those things have to be separatable or you won't be able to implement these programs without having them be directly in conflict with one another.
Well, thank you for that response. Take a quick look, folks, at 29A, and when they say means all environmentally related characteristics is all it says. It doesn't really say anything about emissions or avoid emissions. It says all. So we'll be tangling with that. But thank you for your feedback.
Yeah, Austin, do we have time to open it up for other questions, or how are we doing on schedule?
We have 5 minutes if we'd like to open it up.
Yeah, let's see what's out there.
All right, feel free to put your comments in the chat or raise your hand and get to you.
While we're doing that, I want to clarify that in terms of this definition of non-power attributes, what I included at the bottom of the agenda is not the entire statutory definition. There's a second piece of it that has to do with like methane and things like that, that I think is not relevant to this discussion, but I just didn't want anybody to think that I had copied the entire definition into the agenda.
Kyle, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sorry, was that for me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon. So yeah, I'm curious about. I think Steve and I are getting hung up on the same definition in CETA, and I think Claire and Ezra, you've brought really good arguments on like a pragmatic level about why maybe dealing with these megawatt hours and RPS standards in one section and focusing on emissions and cap and trade and trying to keep those spheres as separate as possible. There's a lot of advantages to that. I think I'm getting stuck on what 29A means. Like the definition of REC in CETA is fairly specific, and the definition of non-power attributes is also specific and inclusive of emissions or no emissions. So when we sell a megawatt hour of emissions-free power to, for example, California, and then also save the REC and retire that for the 20% obligation under CETA, are two different entities recognizing the same attribute, and does that count as does that meet the threshold for double counting? Is kind of the core question that I still had, even though I think the comments here have been pretty persuasive that there are certainly benefits in both ways. So maybe this is more of a legal question. If we want to go down that road, I would be interested in hearing how we might be able to, how the Commission and Commerce should interpret or understand the definitions in the statute, such that we would, such that the retirement of a REC doesn't have to happen whenever there's a claim on a megawatt hour and the associated emissions, specifically the associated zero emissions. Yeah, thanks.
Well, I thought that Claire made an excellent point about, how are you going to count the emissions? The REC represents a zero emissions resource. And then the other piece is a negative emissions, an avoided emissions resource. Under cap and trade, you are not counting anything having to do with the emissions of the REC, of the renewable resource, because there are none. You're just counting the emissions that are actually produced by emitting resources in the compliance region. So perhaps that's another way to look at it, is you're not counting anything having to do with the renewable resource under cap and trade, but you are under a REC program. But, again, you wanted attorneys to, you wanted a legal interpretation. So I probably should not try too hard.
Yeah, and I certainly am not going to get into legal arguments here either. But the way I see it, when under the 80% standard, the entity is procuring energy as well as the RECs, and is procuring it in a way that entitles them to claim the actual zero emission attribute of the resource. Under the greenhouse gas neutral standard, they're not procuring that energy and thus have no right to the zero emission standard, or is it into the actual emission attribute, because they're not buying the power. They are still buying the REC, and they are applying, I would argue, and I think Ezra agrees with me, the avoided emission attribute of that REC for the greenhouse gas neutral standard, since that avoided emission attribute is not being used by an entity in California's program or California itself for the state under its cap and trade program. There is no double counting. That's how I would see it.
Well, that's a good closing statement, I think, and I feel like maybe we should let this panel go with our thanks. Does that sound right, Austin?
Yes, that sounds correct.
Okay, so I do appreciate you talking through that with us. It's been great to have the words come off the page and actually be able to discuss them with us. So thank you for participating in that.
Thank you for your questions.
Lynn, would you like to provide an introduction to our next group as I pull them up here?
Sure, I will. So these are we've invited the sponsors of some other comments from the written record. The utilities as a group, the joint utilities submitted comments. And so from that group, we have Mary Winkie and Ian Hunter. Mary works for Pacific Corp, and Ian works for Snohomish PUD. And then we have, on behalf of Climate Solutions, Vlad Gutman-Britton. And then from Renewable Northwest, we have Katie Ware. And even though it's eventually we're going to get to, letting everybody talk, as in whatever fashion they do. I did actually want to start with a couple of questions for the Renewable Northwest and Climate Solutions panelists, and then I'll turn to Mary and Ian a little bit. So for Katie and Vlad, I wanted to focus on what we've talked about before in this with the dynamic that as renewable electricity is imported into California and replaces fossil generation, that then under that cap, that frees up allowances that then could be picked up by someone outside of the electricity sector. And then there'd be emissions from that activity, so that if the cap is binding and everybody's using all the allowances that are available, the overall emissions that California is counting aren't affected by this. Is that what you would see as kind of the core situation that we're trying to deal with? I mean, is that where the double counting problem in your mind comes from, that renewable electricity, you need to kind of associate with it that new emissions that occur by the alternative use of the allowance? So is that where you would see as the problem that we need to address through double counting rules?
I mean, I think that example is a problem, but I don't think that the double counting language is intended to just be limited to addressing the specific interactions with California cap and trade. We generally, I mean, Steve's kind of set of questions and is our sort of issue here, regardless of where the power is going. The issue is what that receiving entity or jurisdiction claims about it, even if that entity is not functioning under an economy-wide cap and trade program. So I think that example is useful and instructive, but I wouldn't want to, in thinking about this double counting issue, I wouldn't want to limit it to just solving the particular issues attendant in how California treats it. Obviously, I do, as for those of us who are part of those negotiations all those years ago, I do think the California question and examples like what you're describing were sort of front of mind, but it's not intended, I think, only to deal with that specific issue.
Okay. Katie, what do you think?
I agree with Vlad. I think as Washington and California sit currently, that's the easiest comparison and concern to mull over. But more broadly, I think that the concern is that CETA, as written, attempts to provide safeguards against double counting of the same emissions avoided attributes. And if two entities both claim the same avoided emissions, then there's an unaccounted for dirty megawatt hour that escapes that accounting. And if we and then we don't end up actually achieving greenhouse gas neutrality, real greenhouse gas neutrality, not just as calculated on paper. Washington can't control the way other jurisdictions handle their accounting, but we regulators here can do their best to protect against accounting leakage.
And if we've talked a lot about imported renewables, but do you see the same problem with the renewables that are located physically in California, that we should apply a double counting screen to any resources in California, even if they're not used for the California RPS, that their RECs should be screened out for double counting?
I think the issue is where the power is claimed and used, not where the generation is. So, I mean, I wouldn't, unless I'm missing something, which has certainly happened repeatedly in the past. I don't think the issue is whether or not the resource is in California or is in Arizona. It's whether or not its attributes are being claimed in California or, as I said, somewhere else, in addition to Washington. So that's how I think about it. Can I actually, since Katie brought up the avoided emissions, can I kind of speak to Claire's piece or about avoided emissions and direct emissions, or would it be better to do that a little later?
No, go ahead.
So I think that's an interesting approach to thinking about it, but I think it creates a lot of sort of perverse consequences if you can think of those two attributes as completely separable and not related to one another. So if you think about a system where the marginal resource, the marginal megawatt hour has, half a ton of emissions, any new injection to that system avoids that half a ton. And if you can separate that out, so the issue then is, that avoided half a ton, you're avoiding it if you're a coal resource with a ton of emissions, or if you're a wind resource with zero emissions. And so to be coherent, you need these two pieces, the direct emissions from the facility and the avoided emissions, have to be linked. Otherwise, if you can separate them and they have no relationship to one another, you can conceive of a situation where, Montana has a coal unit and it claims the direct emissions, but it sells to Washington the avoided emissions. The idea that these two are separate and not related to one another doesn't make any sense. So that new megawatt hour of coal power in Montana, in this example, avoids half a ton of emissions from what was previously the marginal resource. You can sell that to Washington. Washington has now claimed the avoided emissions, and yet somehow, and Montana claims the 1 ton of direct emissions. If they're not related to one another, the direct emissions and the avoided emissions, you can have these sort of perverse and clearly unintended consequences. So the connection between the direct emissions and the avoided emissions, in my view, is inseparable. If you start separating them, then everything gets an avoided emissions attribute that can be claimed as negative for someone's greenhouse gas neutral program.
Okay. Katie, I know your organization has owners of renewable generating units in it, and so I'm interested in your thoughts about the accounting. Like, if we were able to adopt a rule that said if the electricity were sold into the California market as zero emission, then that REC could not be used in the Washington CETA compliance. Is that sort of restriction one that seems feasible to actually implement on behalf of the generators? Is that workable, do you think?
Absolutely. Our membership has shown nothing but interest in protecting against double counting. And, it's been mentioned that does this devalue the rec? And I would argue that it actually increases the value of the rec to tie the non-power attributes to it and take it to retirement. So I think our membership would agree with that.
And do you have any thoughts on the public council concern about shuffling, that those recs that were disallowed in Washington would end up getting used somewhere else anyway?
Well, my reaction would just be that the requirements in CETA are pretty straightforward. And I think that just because we can hypothesize a certain scenario, we shouldn't water down those requirements and assume the worst of everyone based on one scenario. That would just be my reaction. Okay. And again, we can't control what other jurisdictions do, but we can do our best to protect against that.
Right. All right, I'm going to bring in our joint utility panelists now, to Ian and Mary. And in your comments, you put forward a couple of proposed mechanisms to address the double counting situation with imports into California being our focus today. One of those had to do with the contract language terms for REC transactions. And then the other addressed what generating units that are owned or controlled by Washington utilities would do as far as REC retirements. And I wondered if one of you could summarize that for the group a little bit and just give a short explanation of what your proposal includes.
Sure, I can take a stab at that. And Mary, please feel free to catch anything I overlook. I think at a broad swath, what the utilities are looking to propose is kind of the mechanism for establishing who has the right to make claims on environmental attributes from any given megawatt hour of generation. So to prevent double counting, what we're looking at is if a utility makes a specified source transaction, regardless of whether the REC goes with that or not, that specified source transaction would mean that however many megawatt hours were sold are not eligible for CETA compliance. So in the California example, you could have a specified source sale into California. The Washington utility would retain the REC because the California entities don't require the REC to be retired. But that REC would then not be eligible for CETA compliance, either for the 80% or the 20%, because some portion of the environmental attributes associated with that megawatt of generation have been claimed in another jurisdiction. And so it tries to tighten up the contractual requirement and tie it back to CETA. Because I mean, I think we just heard, Washington State has jurisdiction over Washington State's policies. We can't, make changes to other jurisdictions, but we can at least make sure that if an environmental attribute is claimed elsewhere, that it's not being able to be claimed in Washington State for CETA.
Okay, and then there's also an aspect, as I understand it, about the actual terms of the transaction for RECs, the language that's like from Exhibit R, I think it is, in the WSPP agreement. And I wasn't sure if the joint utility proposal was proposing additional language. And the reason I bring this up is that it seems like the current practice is that the seller will execute a contract that says all of the attributes are going with this sale of the wreck. And yet that doesn't seem to bar them from making the sale of the electricity to California and specifying it as being zero emission. So I wasn't sure if you were proposing new language in that standard, more or less standard contract, or if you were saying that the existing language was sufficient.
I think when it comes down to contractual language and how that intersects with rules, we're looking more for rules to have something more like a concept. I'm not sure we're looking to have like a specific paragraph that would be inserted into every specified source transaction. But I think we want to make sure that rules cover the intent of what we're trying to capture. And the reason we're not looking for specific contract language is different commercial transactions may have different provisions and slightly different wordings. And you want to allow for that flexibility just to have slightly different words, so long as the overall concept is upheld. So to your question, with regard to CETA compliance, if a utility did make that specified source sale of a generator that they own, they would still retain the REC for it, but they would not be able to use that REC for CETA compliance. I don't think CETA has any statutory language that would say what the disposition of that REC had to be, but it couldn't be used for CETA compliance.
Mary, what are your thoughts on what you've heard so far in this?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think it may not be standard practice right now to kind of prohibit that specified sale that, you know, if you're buying the REC, but we think it would be relatively low, you know, low bar to implement something like that in a contract. It may not be standard practice. I think we do right now have some contracts that do go there. But I think we don't think it would be a very difficult bar to accomplish that contractually.
Okay. And then do the utilities have concerns about any sort of competitive advantage or disadvantage that might result if we have rules that limit what a utility owned or controlled renewable unit could do, you know, in terms of the use of RECs that they have after they've sold the power to California, but then other generating units, you know, that are owned by utilities outside of Washington or by independent companies. Are there concerns, you know, do you feel like we need to worry about coming up with a solution that covers all sources of renewable generation regardless of ownership?
I'll take a stab at that.
So
go ahead.
Okay,
Mary.
go ahead, Ian. Oh, I was going to say there could be competitive issues, I think, but I struggle with how this commission would address those. You know, I kind of, from my perspective, it's relatively straightforward to say, like what Ian was saying, that if there's a specified source sale to California or anywhere, to Vlad's point, I mean, any specified source sale to anywhere, the associated REC is not available for CETA compliance. That's relatively straightforward. You know, I do think that there's, you know, from a high level perspective, you know, I agree with really a lot of what Ezra and Claire were saying. I do think there's a lot of unintended consequences here. But I'm not sure that Washington can kind of address all those things, nor should it.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add is if you base it around a specified source sale and then that making it an associated REC ineligible for CETA compliance, kind of regardless of where the generator is located, the playing field is fairly level, because any generator located anywhere, if it makes a specified source sale of the energy, the rec that's associated isn't eligible in Washington. So that would be the same for a Washington utility, for a California utility, or an IPP located anywhere in WEC.
Okay, thanks. Vlad or Katie, do you have any thoughts on these, the proposals that the utilities have put forward, and do you feel like they're on the right track, or any input you want to offer on those?
I mean, I think retiring RECs associated with specified source sales is great, and that improves the outcomes in California as well, even if they don't want to incorporate that similar requirement into their own law. I think that's a really positive thing for the utilities to do. I'm really happy to see that. I do think that this issue around contract language during procuring, I think, is valuable. I want to better understand, but it does seem like the current contract language doesn't fully address this issue that we're discussing. So working through a B tier or more specific version might be one way to go. I think others have, you including inclusive that Glenn had proposed other kind of registries and things like that, which also would be really interesting to explore. But I guess that's my sort of feedback for now.
Yeah, I'll agree. We'd be willing to explore this as a potential, or the registry idea. Sounds like we've got some options, and we're open to any of them that prohibit double counting, of course.
Okay. Anything else the four of you want to offer up before I see if the commissioners and commission staff have questions?
I just have two hopefully quick items, Glenn, if you don't mind. One is just for energy that is deemed delivered to California via the EIM. You wouldn't have a bilateral contract in that situation. So I think you'd have to review, the report that is given to the utility, given, from the CAISO, that basically indicates what resources were deemed delivered to California, and then ensure that those RECs are retired as well. But again, I don't think that would be a difficult thing to accomplish, and there's not, there's no resource specific deeming to any other state too. So that would only be a concern for EIM, deliveries to California. The other thing that I just wanted to mention that I and this is me speaking, not necessarily on behalf of the joint utilities, but something that just struck me as part of the prior conversation, that if we're talking about potentially, unbundled RECs from California not being eligible because, those resources are under a cap, and therefore those RECs don't have any avoided emissions value, or those the RECs have been used in California already, or claimed in California already. I think that because Washington is now in a cap jurisdiction too, I think arguably Washington, unbundled RECs from Washington resources also don't count, using that same logic. So I really do think you kind of, you can get into a situation where you kind of twist yourself in knots here and really get to some kind of unintended consequences. And, again, we have to follow the letter of the law as well, but I just wanted to kind of echo some of those sentiments. And, is it really sort of, are we really accomplishing our goals in the best way if we say that, Washington RECs are ineligible for CETA compliance? I don't think you get there. So.
Yep, no, that's, we have invited comments on, kind of how we need to adjust with the enactment of the Climate Commitment Act, our cap and trade program. And I think that's an ongoing area of work. But it certainly is something that has come up, is what happens when the California analysis is also applicable or may be applicable to Washington State. So anyway, I'll see if commissioners or staff have questions for this panel. I would be happy to hear from you as well. And then after that, we'll pick up Claire's question.
No questions from me, Glenn. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll, sounds like both Claire and Ezra would like to join the conversation a little bit. And I think that might be just great. So Claire, do you want to like maybe just, pose your question or comment instead of having somebody read it?
Sure. And Glenn, I think you had asked this question earlier to Katie, and I'm not sure if Vlad's comment, I think Vlad had also come in to respond on it, but I was a little unclear about the response. And basically, as I had said earlier, when basically California assigns emissions under its mandatory reporting rule, that's effectively assigning a zero emission to renewable generation in state, or assigning zero emission to a specified generation from out of state. It's not being claimed by a specific utility. It's rather the regulator is assigning that emission for purposes of its cap and trade program. What I'm not clear on is Renewables Northwest and Climate Solutions seem to think that there is a material difference between a resource that is located in California and sells unbundled RECs to a Washington utility versus one that's located outside of California and imports energy into California and sells unbundled RECs to utility, Washington utility. So I'm just trying to get clear in my head what that material difference is, or what's the principle here.
Vlad, you're welcome to respond, but I don't hear a difference, actually. I think the concern is the same. I think that if the generation is coming from California and being counted as zero emissions and the unbundled RECs are going to Washington, that's the same concern.
Yeah, I think I kind of, maybe I just don't understand your question, Claire, and I just, invite you to clarify it. But I think, Glenn kind of asked that question, and I think my response was the issue is not where it's located, but how it's claimed. And if it's being claimed as having the zero carbon, as being zero carbon, regardless of where it's coming from, that's what disqualifies the REC from being eligible in Washington.
So just to follow up, so if I understand you correctly, if it's a California renewable resource, the unbundled RECs from that resource would be ineligible for the greenhouse gas neutral standard in Washington. And then I guess going to Mary's point, then by correlation, once we have a cap and trade program in effect, and there's a Washington renewable generation that's effectively zero emission or the cap and trade program, that resource is also ineligible for CETA use by a different utility.
So I think our view is that for a resource, so for a utility to claim a resource, a Washington resource to be claimed, a Washington zero carbon resource to be claimed for the 80%, you would need to, I mean, it gets back to the use conversation, you would need to both demonstrate whatever the use requirements are, we've discussed at length what we think those should be, and retire the REC associated with it. A single entity must do that, not a separate entity. Is that what you're asking about?
No, I thought we were talking only about the unbundled RECs, the 20% in this conversation. Yeah. So I was asking specifically about that scenario.
Yeah.
So I guess just to clarify, or at least what I heard was it might be a circumstance where within Washington, renewable generation, the electricity is sold as unspecified, for instance. Our was zero emission, but no REC was transferred. Then that REC might not be eligible within the 20% as an unbundled REC, on the theory that that generation avoided fossil emissions that would have been subject to the Washington cap. There's a complicated scenario, but
yeah. I mean, I guess the way that I am thinking about this, and Claire, correct me if I'm wrong, but the theory, I think, is that by virtue of being in a cap jurisdiction, you know, resources in California, non-emitting resources in California, as well as non-emitting imports, those RECs don't have avoided emissions value because of the cap. And so I think, and therefore those RECs are not usable for CETA compliance, because CETA requires you to have all the non-power attributes, including the avoided emissions attribute. And I just think that same theory then applies in Washington, because Washington has a cap now, and so you know, RECs from resources in Washington would similarly not have that avoided emissions value. And I think that theory then applies to the 80% or the 20%, I think. And I think that's why in California they did what they did and concluded what they concluded, because otherwise you get into the situation of having to comply separately with cap and trade and with RPS, and that it's just, you know, you have to kind of procure double your energy needs. Doesn't make any sense.
Well, I'm just gonna, so I'm not sure if I'm completely following, but if I am understanding correctly, my view of what we're talking about here, which is cap and trade in conjunction with the more procurement-based law like CETA, within a state's boundaries, it makes sense for a utility to be able to use the same renewable energy to comply with both the cap and CETA. But I would say when you're crossing into another jurisdiction, that's not the case. That's where I would draw this distinction.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say that distinction is practical rather than based on the theories that we've been discussing about the attributes that are included in RECs. And you know, there's no, that distinction is, I think, is a practical distinction just based on how you need to implement programs versus something that is rooted in the theories we've been talking about.
All right, this may be a little change in subject, but and we'll come back to this because Claire wants to. But first, Ezra had asked about responding on the shuffling question and the, you know, whether it was effective to impose this rule. So why don't you do that, Ezra?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I want to be clear that when I talk about resource shuffling, that Katie described it as assuming the worst. I'm not talking about some Enron-like scheme to defraud the market. I'm talking about what would naturally and inevitably occur because entities that have RECs are going to sell them. And if those RECs aren't qualifying for Washington subpart B compliance, they're going to sell them to another jurisdiction. And Washington's going to then buy RECs from somewhere else, perhaps from that other jurisdiction. So there's just no question that this resource shuffling would occur and would thwart the, unless and until we have a West-wide regime that has consistent rules, it is going to thwart any attempt to avoid this kind of double counting. I just want to emphasize that, it's not bad actors, it's just how the market would work. And I actually would love to know what the other panelists think about that, because I really think it's a crucial point if we consider any rules trying to avoid this.
Any thoughts on that?
Thought. Glenn, I'm probably not the one you want to hear from.
No, go ahead. They had their chance.
And this comes back to why I wanted to respond on the previous point. And I've said this before in multiple forums, that we are heading towards a collision in the West of inconsistencies across state programs in terms of how carbon is accounted. I cut my teeth doing carbon accounting, thinking about cap and trade programs. And I actually think that's the correct way to do actual emission accounting, and to the extent that we have to deal with imports, and we do have to deal with imports where we don't have state programs that align with energy markets, we have to account for imports. And that the correct way to do that is to assign it with the electricity flow. That said, I think we all do have the same objective. We're trying to clean up the energy markets within the West. We're trying to move to zero emission resources throughout the West as soon as possible. We have to design all these rules to work with the markets, because we know those markets are expanding. And the procurement type things that are focused solely on trying to force, RECs, square pegs into round holes, are going to run up against these other type of programs, which are going to be necessary for integration in the organized markets, both the EIM and any future RTO. I wanted to jump in earlier in response to Katie's point that if they cross state boundaries, we should make a distinction or practical distinction versus power that's within a state. That's not how energy flows. That's not how energy markets work. The California ISO dispatches every single resource within of the utilities and the resources that are within the ISO, and all that power is available into the EIM. When there is surplus solar on the grid in California, that stuff is not getting used for a state RPS. That's coming out. It's going to EIM. Energy GPS has done studies that have shown, that power crosses Pacific Core system and is used by Puget during times when there's clean energy on the grid. We shouldn't be saying that stuff is not valid in Washington, because we share a common objective across states of cleaning up the grid. So I think these distinctions of state borders are quite honestly irrelevant in the context of energy markets, and unhelpful when we think about where we want to go with clean energy.
Can I offer a friendly amendment to that, to what Claire said? Maybe I missed it, Claire, but the energy that is, oversupply, solar oversupply in California, that's coming out via EIM, and PacifiCorp and other entities with fossil resources are able to back down their fossil in order to take that oversupply. Those RECs are staying in California for the California RPS. The RECs aren't coming out via EIM or any other mechanism. The entities in California are keeping those RECs and using it for their RPS compliance. And so I do think that there is an issue there where if you establish an emission profile associated with that energy, you've really disincentivized the utility from taking it when it's actually, a very low cost way of reducing emissions. So I think maybe a little off topic, Glenn, but just to kind of agree with Claire on some of the challenges that we're facing here in terms of all different states implementing 100% or very high clean renewable standards. And then I also just wanted to comment a little bit sort of on this question of shuffling. I think my perspective is that there's less of that. I feel less concerned about that, I guess, is kind of what I would say, that you know, we can put contractual protections in place, we can do other things. Can we absolutely, you know, prohibit any kind of that activity? Probably not. But I also think you have utilities who have an incentive to keep their recs for compliance and other reasons. And so I just, you know, from my perspective, I don't see it as a huge issue, but I don't know, other utilities may look at it differently.
Okay, I'm hearing that Todd Jones from the Center for Resource Solutions would like to ask a question. So that's maybe it is time for us to open this up to the workshop participants overall, and if they've got questions or comments. I guess what we should do is first kind of, and I think Todd, I take it he has a question for this panel. And we'll do that and other questions that are specific to this panel, and then we'll have more of a open mic session. So Todd, why don't you go ahead?
So just to clarify, yes, I do have a question, but I also have a public comment for later. And
okay.
You would, okay, so which would you want the question now and the public comment later? Or
yeah, let's do that.
Now? Okay, all right. So my question actually, Glenn, it's more for you in the state. Sorry. Has Washington State clarified that the role of unbundled RECs under CETA is not to verify delivery of zero emissions power based on the direct emissions attribute, like the broader role of RECs under CETA, but rather to offset quote unquote emissions based on the avoided emissions associated with the generation? I've heard a couple of people sort of mention that, and my understanding was that even though unbundled RECs are included as sort of alternative compliance under this 20%, that they nevertheless were being included under CETA in their capacity as the verification tool or instrument to verify delivery of those attributes to meet the objective under CETA, which is to meet, you know, retail sales with non-emitting and renewable or GHG neutral retail sales. But it seems like on this panel that there was that the understanding is rather that they are included in that capacity as an alternative compliance instrument based on their avoided emissions and use as sort of an offset equivalent to other sort of projects that may also be used for alternative compliance, in which case now there's this question of, well, because of, you know, RECs associated with power in California that may not have an avoided efficiency value due to the cap, which I don't think anyone is denying, that would disqualify them from Washington. Does my question, am I being clear, Glenn? I'm sorry.
I'm not sure. I can't really treat the whole thing as a question, but the first part, you know, I don't think that we have really interpreted these provisions in CETA one way or the other. That's kind of what we're trying to do in this rulemaking. But what we have in front of us are the, you know, the characterization of the 2030 standards being a greenhouse gas neutral standard. And we have the definition of a REC as including non-power attributes, one of which is this emissions or avoided emissions attribute. And so I think we have tended to approach this looking at it as kind of comparable to under greenhouse gas accounting protocols, what scope 2 emissions would be, you know, could be addressed by, you know, like say a corporation where they're purchasing electricity and using it that's not renewable, but they can purchase and retire unbundled RECs to go with that.
Right, so
However,
then
under that
that's,
well, I was gonna say that under that provision, there's not a no double counting rule, where here we do have this no double counting rule.
there is, but then that answers the question. Then the answer is that the role of unbundled RECs under CETA is to verify delivery of zero emissions power based on the attributes associated with that REC to customers in Washington. That's how the accounting under scope 2 certainly works, based on the direct emissions factor. They're not used as emissions reductions or offsets based on avoided grid emissions. So I think I have my answer, but thank you.
Okay. Any other workshop questions for the panel specifically?
Glenn, I wanted to step in and thank the panel members for their comments today. And I've heard a lot of discussion about how CETA, cap and trade, and both in Washington and other in California will interact, and different scenarios about whether the implementation of CETA will have certain outcomes and whether those outcomes were expected within CETA's goals. And it seems all very terrifying, but to add something even more terrifying than that, I wanted to mention both the US Constitution and the Washington Constitution, specifically the separation of powers, because as an agency, what we have to do is implement the law as it's written. And that, in the case of CETA, may then turn out to have conflicts or unintended consequences when it interacts with both the California cap and trade and the new cap and trade program in Washington state. And what's important to understand about the separation of powers, even with a quasi-judicial organization like the commission, is we render decisions within the scope of the law. And that lays plain for the public to see how this one law works, both for you all and ultimately legislators, because that's you can either consider it a circle or a very functional group of actors, legislative, courts, and the executive branch. And so, it may well be that we lay down rules that fit the terms and statutory meaning of the words in this law CETA, and that shows clear to the public the kinds of problems you're identifying. But I really say that there are separations of powers, and I can't ask the commission or ask the courts to allow the commission to amend a law, or to say, well, I really think it really wanted to do this. Let's ignore that language over there. So I've really heard what you've said about the conflicts and the complications and the unintended consequences and perhaps cost effects. And so know you're being heard, and that I'm hearing these kinds of conflicts and have thought about them and will continue to do, but that the solution may not be within the scope of the authority of an executive branch decision if the law's language is the way it is. So it's not that I'm disregarding your concerns, but that I'm in an interpretation of the law that has to meet the letter of the law, and that may inform the public in general. So I just wanted to really say that because I found this discussion here very useful today. So thank you.
All right, Glenn, if we have no further questions from the commissioners or staff, let's move on to the public comment period.
All right. Well, so Vlad, Mary, Katie, Ian, thank you very much for helping us with that. It was very informative discussion, and having Claire and Ezra come back in to contribute to it, I thought worked real well. So thank all 6 of you for your help with this today. And so I will turn it back over to Austin, and he's going to help us with public comments, where anybody who's got thoughts on this is welcome to let him know, and he'll run the process.
Perfect. Thanks, Glenn. And thanks again to our panelists and everyone participating today. We are going to turn to our public comment portion of today's workshop, where if you'd like to submit anything to the record per se, put it on the recording. We welcome that. We do have Todd Jones, who said he would like to make a public comment. So let's start with him. In the meantime, feel free to put your name or write that you have a comment in the chat, or raise your hand using that feature, and we will get to you. So Todd, you'd like to kick us off?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is Todd Jones from Center for Research Solutions. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. Based on our understanding of both programs, it would be double counting if electricity from a renewable generator is counted as a zero emissions import into California, and the associated RECs are used for CETA compliance in Washington. The same zero emissions generation would be delivered to 2 different states. And the reporting of zero emissions renewable imports to California under cap and trade does constitute a claim on the environmental attributes. The imports piece of California cap and trade is load-based, and CETA is also load-based. Even though California's cap and trade is presented as a source-based program, imported electricity is defined by California as electricity generated outside the state of California and delivered to serve load located inside the state of California. And GHG attribution in EIM, quote, determines if a resource is serving load in the California GHG compliance area, as opposed to load in Washington, for example. Like CETA, under this piece of cap and trade, California is accounting for generation attributes delivered to load in California. It does affect CETA and RECs. That's the material difference that Ms. Bradenich was asking about between RECs from a California generator, not claimed as used towards California load under cap and trade, and RECs from a generator outside of California, where the power is imported to California and reported as zero emissions power delivered to load in California. California's own Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee acknowledged this in its 2019 report, saying, quote, if a neighboring state associates a REC with a low or zero carbon resource, when California also counts the low or zero carbon resource with the associated energy delivery, there is a potential to count, albeit using different metrics, the same low or zero emissions attribute twice. It doesn't matter that the programs are different in other ways. Accounting should be consistent among load-based programs, whether they measure fuel type or direct emissions. But CETA is not just a renewable energy program. It regulates GHG neutral and not emitting and renewable sales, and it uses RECs. Ms. Bradenich said that RECs were not conceived to account for emissions and they're not well suited to it. Load-based accounting for fuel type, emissions, or both affects RECs, which include the direct GHG emissions of the renewable generation or the zero emissions benefit, as RECs are defined in both Washington and California. Contrary to what Dr. Hausman said, they do not only include the fuel type. And contrary to what Ms. Bradenich said, California has not determined that RECs do not include the direct emissions associated with generation. Power source disclosure to customers in California, which requires RECs for GHG emissions intensity calculations. RECs are required under the RPS and for accounting under SB 100. And the CPUC has identified lower, low, or no polluting emissions from the generation itself as being the first and foremost attribute that's included in a REC. It also doesn't matter that California's cap and trade doesn't allocate attributes or emissions to utility load specifically. It does allocate the generation to state load by definition, and it would still be double counting if the RECs were used for a GHG delivery claim in a different state using the same generation. It also doesn't matter that cap and trade doesn't regulate utilities. The conflict is between programs in different states, not between programs within a state. California may decide that RECs associated with California imports can also be used for California's RPS. That's its portfolio approach, and it's fine. Washington may likewise decide that RECs used for CETA can also be used for Washington's RPS, and that the associated emissions can also be counted under cap and trade in Washington. Finally, avoided emissions. Avoided emissions aren't at issue. I agree with Ms. Bradenich that these two attributes often get conflated. We are talking about the direct emissions attribute associated with generation. If a zero emissions megawatt hour is imported, defined as delivered to serve load in California, then the same zero emissions megawatt hour cannot also be used for retail sales in Washington. That's double counting. The fact that the zero emissions megawatt hour does not avoid emissions on the grid due to the cap, which no one is denying, or if, like Dr. Hausman, you don't think that avoided emissions, or what he calls the benefits of a REC, can be determined at all, that's irrelevant to this double counting concern. But I disagree with Ms. Bradenich that RECs are principally used for avoided emissions accounting. I don't think that's true in either voluntary or compliance markets. I also disagree that the direct emissions rate usually, either physically or automatically contractually, follows the power. RECs are the common accounting instrument for the direct emissions associated with renewable generation across the US. RECs are commonly used to account for the direct emissions associated with the generation, the emissions associated with delivered or purchased electricity in contracts, in compliance programs like CETA, and in voluntary markets. That's called scope 2 accounting. And it accounts for direct emissions, not avoided emissions. And it's much more common than using RECs and renewable energy to account for avoided emissions. I don't think it's absurd that RECs contain both the direct and the avoided emissions attribute. A megawatt hour of generation from a renewable resource is both zero emitting and has an emissions effect on the grid. In either case, it's used as a tracking tool for delivery and use claims, since that cannot be physically measured at the point of consumption. It's also not absurd for these attributes to remain bundled together in the REC. It allows for all load-based programs to deliver zero emissions power from renewable resources and achieve emissions reductions beyond other programs. The REC-based program both delivers zero emissions power and power that avoids emissions. And REC owners can claim to be using zero emissions power and that their generation, the generation they're purchasing, avoids emissions. That doesn't affect source-based programs. RECs are not being used as emissions reductions or offsets where they are used to track delivery of zero emissions attributes. Finally, just the joint utilities have already proposed to exclude RECs associated with power that is sold to California, into California and counted as zero emissions resource under California cap and trade as a protection against double counting. So at the August 12th workshop on interpretations of use, the joint utility proposal would put, quote, strong double counting protections in place requiring the specified source sales are excluded from both the 80% primary compliance and 20% alternative compliance. Ms. Swinky for Pacific Corp said that includes both Regis making sure the RECs are used for CETA. RECs used for CETA will not be used for another purpose, and also that specified sales for programs that don't require RECs will also be excluded. And she gave the specific example of California's cap and trade program. To the extent, to your question, Glenn, that this may not prevent double counting where electricity is not sold or purchased by a Washington utility, for example, where a generator sells specified source electricity into California and then sells the REC to a Washington utility, we still need access to the REC serial information collected by CARB under the MRR so that we can identify the RECs associated with generation that's being counted as zero emissions imports into California. They should be identified in Regis, and they should not be permitted for use under CETA in order to achieve intended objectives and to move faster toward achieving our overall mitigation goals. Thank you, and I apologize for taking so long.
Thank you, Todd, for your comment. We're going to go to Michael Gillenwater next, who has his hand raised. And I'd also at this time like to encourage everyone that sometimes these conversations can get very complicated and nuanced, and it can feel hard to want to, provide a comment in that environment. And we just welcome any thoughts that you have and would like to submit. So Michael, please unmute and give us your question or comment.
Sure, thank you, and I'll be brief. And yeah, this topic can get pretty wonky, and it's easy to get lost in the details. I just a brief comment to caution you and others on this workshop with the analogy of what we'll refer to as the scope 2 accounting and the use of RECs in that environment. It is actually not well accepted that is a good practice. Actually, a large number of GHG accounting experts around the world have publicly gone on record saying that that's actually a flawed approach to corporate accounting. But more importantly, the analogy of kind of voluntary corporate accounting being applied to a regulatory cap and trade environment is just the analogy doesn't hold well. So I would just caution that way of thinking first. Secondly, and that goes to the claim that RECs do I guess contain or hold or represent direct emissions. Again, I would not agree that that's well accepted. And I think that the key thing here is the differentiating. There's lots of different kinds of RECs out there. As we know, different RPSs in different jurisdictions define different kinds of RECs. There's obviously a voluntary market for RECs, which I think is being applied here. There's obviously California compliance RECs. So there's to assume that they're all equivalent when you have very different definitions and drivers of demand for them in these jurisdictions is problematic. I mean, I think we have to be very clear about that. So pulling and retiring a REC from a compliance market that has an RPS is very different from a voluntary market REC. And just to reiterate on Ezra's point earlier, I guess I would agree with kind of his framing. The RECs are intended for RPS compliance, and the minute you take them out of that context, then we get into these kind of complicated debates that we're talking about now. And I think one should hesitate when doing that, and because there can be major cases for double counting.
Thanks, Michael. For the record, could we get your organization?
Oh yeah, apologize. I meant to do that at the beginning. Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. We're a nonprofit that trains experts around the world on carbon accounting. So,
thank you, Michael. We had a comment earlier from Jeff Giffen Corix, probably pronouncing that wrong, and I apologize. I don't know if Jeff, if you would like to unmute, raise your hand, and offer a comment for the group on this, or not.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Hey, thanks, guys. Interesting conversation. Relatively novice at all of this accounting stuff when it comes to RECs and things. I mean, I have done some reading on it, and I think my main concern, it sounds like we're going down the path of having RECs, which clearly seems to be the real issue here of double counting, is the RECs in the first place. But I would say if we have to do RECs, how can we assure that we're getting quality RECs that are actually doing something? I think there's a lot of information out there, and the RECs are selling for so cheap, it's coming out about $1 a ton. And it just seems like, if we're really doing something about the carbon problem here, chances are it should cost a lot more than $1 a ton. So how can we ensure that the utilities are purchasing these RECs, because they will use their full 20% for sure, because it's going to be the cheapest path to compliance. How can we ensure that they're getting quality RECs and it's not a free rider that's basically something that would have happened anyway? Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. And can we get your organization as well?
Yeah, I'm with Corix Utilities.
Perfect. Thank you. And I don't see any other requests to comment at this time. Give people a moment. I see Dave Warren has unmuted his mic. Dave, would you like to give us your organization and provide a comment?
Yeah, actually, it's a question and thoughts trying to wrap my head around this entire afternoon. I'll ask the question on behalf of Klickitat PUD, which is a large producer of renewable natural gas. And it's a question, and I don't know the answer, and I'm not assuming anybody could give the answer today. But given these discussions, RNG is defined as a renewable resource in Washington law, both in the Energy Independence Act and in CETA, including all the attributes in the definition of RECs. And yet Ecology, when they wrote the Clean Air Rule, gave it a compliance obligation as an emitter of greenhouse gases. So when Claire first explained her process, I went, well, that sort of fits what happened here. But if RNG is used to generate electricity, at least under our Clean Air Rule, and how that transfers to our Climate Commitment Act and CETA, I'm not yet sure. It has a compliance obligation as an emitter, and yet if it sells into the renewable fuels market, it is considered a greenhouse gas reduction fuel. So I'm putting that out there. Our conversation was going around wind and solar as zero emission, but we have another renewable resource called renewable natural gas that doesn't fit into these nice definitions. So I just wanted to pose that for now to see how we how that will fit into these otherwise clean, no emission renewables under law and the different interpretations. So I just thought I'd put that out there. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Any other comments people would like to provide? If not, Glenn, I think we can move to wrapping the workshop up and getting it done around 4 o'clock. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Austin. And I appreciate the discussion overall today, the panelists in particular, but also the people who contributed, with questions and comments at the end. It was, this is an issue that's certainly one of the more complicated ones that we're dealing with in implementing CETA, in an area where there's both a lengthy history of trying to figure out interactions between these two different ways of trying to reduce our, the global impact of our electric emissions. And today, I think, seen, a lot of good faith efforts to try to make sense of it all and keep our eyes on the overall objective of reducing emissions. In terms of next steps, we will include the discussion today in our thinking, and by our, I mean the Utilities and Transportation Commission and Commerce. We are, aiming for a deadline next June to adopt rules to address both double counting and the effect of market transactions. And so we continue to work on that and hope to provide some form of draft rule for stakeholders to look at and react to. I don't have a specific date in mind, but that will be the next step, is for us to go back and review all this material and see what we can come up with as a draft rule language. Unless we get back there and figure out we need, some more specific information of some sort, in which case, we could put out a comment request or something like that. But anyway, we'll continue to engage on this and let you know how we're doing, and we'll look forward to your continued participation and guidance on this question. I think that's it for me. Maybe on the UTC side, there's closing remarks, but that's it for me.
Thanks, Glenn. Do we have any closing remarks from the commissioner staff?
Well, hi, this is Dave. I just want to say thanks. This has been a really good conversation. As I said, I've been taking a lot of notes. This has been an issue we've been struggling with for months and months, as you know. I think there is so much to consider here. And I'm hoping that we're going to resolve this soon. Again, it was a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it. And I got a lot from CARB this morning as well. So thank you, Glenn and Austin, for putting this together. Thank you, Kyle and Steve. And we will continue our deliberations. So thank you much.
Thanks, Dave. Steve, I saw you turned off your camera earlier. Do you have any remarks you want to leave us with?
No, I was just stepping in, but Dave said it all.
Perfect. Well, again, you can reach us at our email, CETA@commerce.wa.gov, if you have any questions or further comments. And we'll continue to update you on the status of our rulemaking through our CETA bulletin. And we appreciate everyone's participation today. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.